welcome and thanks everyone for joining. We're going to be talking about my future fund. So I'm Caitleen Desetti and I'm an industrial relations organizer for the FSU. I work most of the time with our members in the banks. So I don't think I've met many, if any of you actually, because we're just talking to our animators and game workers today. So it's nice to meet you all. Like I said, we're going to talk about my future fund today. This is Ireland's new auto-enrolment scheme coming in the 1st of January. So it's a huge change. And thank you, Lynn, nice to meet you too. It's a huge change. It's the result of years of union campaigning. ICTU was really active in trying to push for this to get a fairer, more inclusive pension system for all workers to be getting their employers to pay into their future retirement security. So it is, in my view, in the general trade union movement's view, it's a really positive development and reflects the power of collective action in shaping policies that benefit working people. So I think particularly relevant for creative industries is that there can be a proliferation of short-term contracts, of precarious work, and this new system should make a big difference to your retirement savings going forward for your future. So the aim of it is pretty simple. It's to make sure that every worker has an easy, fair, and portable pension pot so that they can save for retirement without needing to navigate complex private pension rules for those that don't have an occupational pension scheme. And Ireland has benefited in setting this up from some of the learnings from international examples. So on the one hand, Ireland's been waiting longer than a lot of other European countries for auto-enrollment, which is frustrating. But then on the flip side, from what I can see, a lot of the issues of other countries are improved upon in this version, at least. And so that is a benefit. There's not waiting times to qualify, and there's not, a proliferation of your pension pots if you move from employer to employer. So these things are improvements. So we do have the benefit of those learnings. Let me click on with my slides. So why does it matter? Like I said, I think it's particularly relevant by Maeve. I think it's particularly relevant to the animation games industries because a lot of people do have multiple employers. That was most of the questions that got submitted in advance of the webinar were about multiple employers or working on successive short-term contracts, or you might even have a combination of some freelance work that's self-employed with some part-time work that's under employment. So until now, that's made saving for your pension really difficult. So hopefully this is going to be an improvement for you. So I will just talk a bit about how the scheme works, and then talk through what I think are probably FAQs, and then we'll have Q&A at the end, so you can save your questions until the end, hopefully, unless there's something super burning that you want to answer or ask while I'm talking. But if you can, save it to the end. My future fund is the auto-enrollment scheme. Like I said, it's meant to complement the state pension, so it's not intended to replace the state pension, but rather to give workers an extra source of income in retirement. And I do think there's a worry out there generally about the future of the state pension and the rate of it right now not being actually sufficient to live on given cost of living. And so while that's unacceptable, this is part of the government's response to try to supplement that and get employers paying in. And I think in the past, employers were much more likely to have pension schemes and more generous pension schemes than now. We've seen the death of defined benefit schemes, which were much more favorable. So it's about that. It's about complementing in the future and not necessarily replacing. So once you meet the eligibility rules, you will be automatically enrolled, and then you and your employer both will have to make contributions, and the state tops it up. So just in terms of what is that eligibility criteria then? You first of all have to be an employee. So this doesn't apply to self-employed people. Your earnings have to be above €20,000 in a year, aged between 23 and 60, and not already in a qualifying occupational or private pension. that 20,000 threshold is cumulative. So if you have multiple employers, if between them all you are earning 20,000 or more, then they all have to pay in, no matter how small of a paycheck you have from them, and they have to pay in so long as your cumulative earnings are above 20K. It is starting January 1st, like I said. There's not a waiting period, so you should be, if you're falling under this scheme, you're in from the 1st of January. The contribution rate, they are phasing in contributions over the next 10 years in chunks of 3 years. So starting January 1st, for 3 years, it's going to be you paying in 1.5%, your employer paying in 1.5%, the state paying in 1/2%. So that is a total contribution of 3.5%. In the next 3 years, so 2029 to 2031, that's going to go up to total contribution of 7%. And then the next 3 years, 10.5%. And then from 2035 onwards, the full rate will be a total contribution of 14%, which is 6% from you, 6% from your employer, and 2% from the state. So the state is paying in, and I'm sure you've all seen those ice cream cone ads where it states this clearly in the ad, but the state is paying in €1 for every €3 that you're paying into your pot. Okay. Contributions are capped at 80,000 salary. So what that means is that you'll get your contributions up until, if you earn over 80,000, up until the point at which you get paid €80,000, and after that point the contributions will cease. So I do think this is a good way to go about it. If you do have different contracts and a mix of employments, then it's not that the contributions are prorated at the start of the year or anything like that. It's just that the paycheck in which you are earning 81,000, you no longer have your employer contributions or the state contributions, or the employee. We expect that the employee contributions could voluntarily continue after 80,000. But it still is early days, and some of those sort of operating details are still to be worked out in the finer details. So I would expect that if you're earning over 80,000, you yourself could keep contributing, but certainly the employer and state cons will stop after 80,000. There is no tax relief on these contributions, so that's a really big difference to occupational pension schemes and private pension schemes, where you're getting up to 40% tax relief depending on your income and the income tax that you're paying. So you're getting the state contribution here as sort of compensation for the lack of tax relief, if you will. So that's why you get a state top up in this scheme, but not in an occupational pension scheme, because the occupational pension scheme gets that up to 40% tax relief. The state contribution here, what the figures that I've seen is that it's equivalent to about a 25% tax relief, so it's not as favorable on the tax side. The state contribution itself is paid tax-free though, and your employer contributions are not subject to BIK. So that's just on the taxation side I wanted to mention. Who's running the scheme? There's a new state body called NERSA, and they'll be overseeing, they'll be actually running, not just overseeing, they're running and overseeing auto-enrollment. There is Patricia King has a seat on that body. She's the former general secretary of ICTU, so we're lucky that we have someone who's a really strong voice for workers on that body, and hopefully she'll help to, you know, continue to make improvements as some of those finer details are ironed out in the early days of the scheme. The employer's only role here is to process payroll deductions. So NERSA is handling everything else. There's really very little burden on employees, so there's a high expectation of compliance. If your employer is saying, oh, like it's so complicated, I can't comply, they're lying. And NERSA is quite serious in signposting that they intend to prosecute and levy fines against non-compliant employers really early on if there's any resistance to this. And it has been intentionally designed to be really low burden to employers. And that's been one of those benefits from international learnings where in other countries, especially smaller employers have said that, you know, it's too burdensome. They don't have the staff to process all this information and payroll, etc. So hopefully that won't be an issue and that will reduce any instance of non-compliance. And then on the sort of administrative side, administrative fees expected to be super low. It's a really simple system. It's pretty black and white. If you're there or you're not, there's not a bunch of individual choice within it. So if you do have an occupational pension scheme, you probably would be familiar with getting to decide like, oh, I have a higher risk appetite and I want my pot going into riskier investments and all of that. That's not an option in the auto-enrollment scheme. So that reduced administrative burden does mean that fees will be a lot less. So that's, you know, good on the fee side. My doggy has just returned from his walk, so that's just a slight interruption. Sorry, guys. So the state's going to be overseeing the system. They're going to be choosing the investments. There's not that kind of individual choice. So that is a key difference to occupational pension schemes. It is defined contribution, which means that the value of your pot will fluctuate with the markets, the same as any defined contribution scheme. Okay. So on to my sort of FAQs. What happens if I want to opt out? You can opt out. You will be automatically enrolled. And after 6 months of being enrolled, you can then choose to opt out before the 8th month. So you've got a 2-month period in which you can opt out. They've made it really limited because the aim here is to encourage consistent savings. So opt out is pretty limited. It's that 2-month window. If you'll be automatically re-enrolled after 2 years again, though, and then again you could after that window you can opt out again. You can suspend your contributions though. So if something's going on in your life, you're trying to, I don't know, say for a deposit, you don't want to be paying in those contributions, you can suspend contributions after that 6 months and resume them later. You will, again, the same 2-year trigger period applies. So if you suspend your contributions, you'll be automatically they will automatically resume after 2 years, and after which point you can suspend them again if you want. But it's making sure that people don't just take an action and then not re-enroll out of a willing desire not to be in there, but just out of not thinking of it, you know. I think I said everything on the opt-out. What happens if my income drops below 20,000? Once you're enrolled, you stay enrolled. So if later on your income drops below 20,000, you can suspend, or if you're changing employer, you can opt out. But you're not going to be automatically taken off of this scheme. Okay. What happens if I change employer? The pot travels with you. You keep the same pot throughout your life. Under the auto-enrollment scheme, under my future fund. So this again was a learning elsewhere where people who change employers a lot would end up with loads of individual pots that were stagnant. And so that's a big difference in the Irish version of this scheme compared to, I think it's the UK, where people would end up with 10 different pots. So your pot travels with you. What happens if I have multiple employers? You have one single pot that they all pay into. So once you're reaching the 20,000 cumulative income, every single one of your employers must pay in. What happens if one of those employers has an occupational pension scheme, but not the rest of them? You remain on your occupational pension scheme for that one employer, and any employer that doesn't have that, they have to pay in. So in that case, you'll have your occupational pension scheme, and then you'll have your My Future Fund. That's all of those other employers paying in. What happens if my employer provides an occupational pension scheme that's less favorable? So I think it's not that likely that this will be the case, but if you think it might be the case for you, just have a look at the numbers. Your options depend on Sometimes an occupational pension scheme is mandatory and sometimes it's voluntary. If it's mandatory, you don't have another option. You stay on your occupational pension scheme, you're not going to be auto-enrolled. If it's voluntary, then you could theoretically opt out of it. And then if you opt out of it, you will be automatically enrolled in this. What happens if your employer refuses to comply? I mentioned the NARS is quite serious about prosecution and levying fines early on with this. So we don't expect it, but that they will be subject to prosecution and fines. So I am already in a pension scheme and am auto-enrolled erroneously. So auto-enrollment is based entirely on what's showing up on your pay slip. So if you have pension contributions that are being processed through payroll, you shouldn't be enrolled. But there are some situations in which certain types of pensions mightn't show up on your pay slip, and so it's possible in those scenarios it will be rectified and your contributions would be refunded. And I meant to say that about opting out too. If after 6 months you choose to opt out, your employee contributions will be refunded, but your employer and state contributions will remain in that pot for you forever. So you will still, even if you opt out, you still have the pot, and it's going to just have your employer and state contributions in it for that 6-month period. And then what happens if I have an existing private pension? So if you don't have an occupational pension scheme, but you've taken it upon yourself to get a private pension, you should just go and look at the benefits of that private pension and decide for yourself if it's more favorable to keep that, in which case you won't be auto-enrolled, or if it's more favorable to stop those contributions and go on to auto-enrollment. It will really depend on your personal situation because the taxation is different, because different pension schemes have different benefits. It really depends. So you need to make that choice for yourself, or if you have, if you have a financial advisor, you can always ask that person for their advice too, but it's an individual choice. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything serious from my notes over here. I don't think so. What should you be doing now? Checking if you're eligible, first of all. Are you in the age bracket 23 to 60? Are your earnings above 20,000? Do you have an existing pension? And just on the 20,000 earnings, if you do have a combination of self-employment and employment, this is only for employees. So your self-employment wouldn't count toward the 20,000. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about your eligibility. If you have multiple employers, add them all up, see if it's applicable to you, and estimate the impact on your take-home pay. The first 3 years, you'll only be paying in 1.5%. So while it's low compared to 6% later on, 1.5% can still be a significant amount of people's income, depending on your income level and your life. So just be prepared for that. If you're expecting a pay increase in the new year, maybe just mentally earmark that for your contributions. And then like I said at the end of the last slide, if you have a private pension, just compare the benefits with my future fund. The last thing I think I forgot to mention on the last slide is that question of occupational pension schemes and what's more favorable. It is expected that in about 7 years' time, that legislation will come in that puts in place mandatory contribution minimums. And so at that point in time, it certainly wouldn't be the case that any occupational scheme would for some reason be less favorable. There would be mandatory minimums then. So I'd be surprised if it was the case now. Anyway, so just in sum, it's a really big change. It's going to have a big impact on people who aren't saving at all for their retirement at this time. Like I said, it's the result of years and years of the trade union movement campaigning for something that would get employers to pay into retirement security for people, particularly lower paid workers in more precarious employments on short-term contracts, etc. It does away with some of those pitfalls of international examples that I would have referenced throughout about waiting periods, where you saw some employers, if there was a 3-month waiting period, they would just fire and rehire to stop their liability to pay contributions. So day one of your employment, if you go somewhere new, you are getting pension contributions in this scheme. Yeah, it's open to all employers aged 23 to 60, earning at least 20,000, and then you get the contribution from yourself, from your employer, and from the state, and that pot sticks with you wherever you go. Resources, if you want to read anything more about this, gov.ie has a pretty good page, and they also have another FAQ page that's really good as well. So you can go there to learn something more. Citizens Information is one of the best websites for any sort of information on state schemes or your rights and entitlements. It's so good and really simple, simply written. So that's a really good resource for this and many other items. Of course, your union, so you can talk to your rep or contact our advice center. If you've been in contact with the advice center before, James Callahan, he's up to speed on auto-enrollment, and he'd be a really good resource if you have questions. And then, of course, your employer. So your HR and your payroll contact should be able to, if you have HR, otherwise your payroll contact should be someone who's giving you information about this and able to answer some of your questions. So that's everything that I have planned to say. I saw a couple things going up in the chat. So I'm going to flip over to here and see. Okay, Kate says, I have a private pension that I set up with the bank, and I pay a small amount in each month, which my employer doesn't pay into what I saw. So yes, so I think I've covered this, but if you're paying if you're paying into a private pension, then you're not going to be auto-enrolled. Presumably that's going through your payroll. You're not going to be auto-enrolled, and you just need to look at, you just need to crunch the numbers yourself and see what's more favorable. Because it could be the case that with the, depending on your contribution rates and those benefits with the up to 40% tax relief on your current scheme, it could still be more favorable, even though you're not getting the employer contributions. So you need to look at those numbers yourself and consider. But if you have a private scheme, you won't be auto-enrolled. If you stop paying your private scheme, be auto-enrolled. Okay. So another question. Yeah, I had an employer complaining earlier this year about the thought of having to implement this. Yeah, it made me feel uncomfortable and fearful that companies will try to skirt it. So everything that I have learned about this is that it is really super low burden as possible for employers. They're not having to fill in information about individual employees, anything like that. All they're doing is facilitating a payroll deduction. So yeah, they're just whinging, I think, if they're saying that. That's my understanding. And I hope we do see really serious action from NERSA if employers are trying to skirt it, because it's not acceptable, and they need to do that really early on to show how serious this is. Paul says it was informative. Thank you, Paul. If my employment ends and I work freelance, can I continue to contribute into the pot voluntarily? So no. And part of it is that this scheme, it has very few individual choices in it. And that's by design, in order to make it as light on administration as possible for the state also. So my understanding is that you wouldn't, if your employment ends and you're self-employed, you would not have access to pay into this voluntarily. It's only for employees. Unless something changes and they legislate for something for self-employed in the future, but you would then need to go and look at taking out a private pension. The pension I have isn't on my, what I will say, sorry, to follow up on that question, is that if your employment ends, you go and you work freelance for a while, you're paying into your own private pension, and then you become an employee again somewhere else later, is that your pot will then resume, and it'll be the same pot. Okay. the pension I have isn't on my payroll. It just comes from my current account. Would that still count? So this is an example where you could be erroneously enrolled, and it still counts as having a pension. But there's a chance that if it's not caught, you might be accidentally enrolled under auto-enrollment, and you might have to contact them and say, actually, here's the evidence of my own pension that I want to keep and is more favorable, and can you can you refund my contributions, please? So it's just one to keep an eye out when that comes in January. But have a look if you're doing a private pension and it's not through payroll. Hopefully you're getting your tax relief on it through revenue at the end of the year. Am I right in understanding that the longer you stay at a company, the higher the employer contributions are? Or is it about the cumulative contributions overall that affect employer contributions? So, Greg, the rate is always the same. I think probably what's happened here is you've seen that the rates are phasing in over 10 years, and that's only to do with the introduction of the scheme itself. So it's not about it's not phasing in for every employer that you're going into. It's only phasing in for the introduction of the scheme, if that makes sense. So in 2035, no matter where you go, you're gonna get the full contributions even on day one of your employment. I think that answered the second part of the question as well. Is about the cumulative contributions overall that affect. There's no your employer contributions, they simply don't change based on any, it's really black and white. And that's part of the intentional design to make it as simple as possible in order to reduce administration fees and such. Good to know. Thank you. Big relief. Oh yeah, great. Greg, yeah. Thanks a bunch. Yeah, guys, if there's any more questions, pop them in the chat. You can raise your hand too and unmute. That's fine if you prefer to ask your question live. Otherwise, feel free to reach out if something comes up. I will ask Maeve maybe to send around the slides to, or I suppose I have all your emails from the registration page. So anyway, you'll get all the slides after this. And so you'll have that to look back at. And the only caveat I'll add is that some of the small details of the scheme might still be tweaked as time goes on. It is still early days, so some little things might change, but for the most part, like this is what's coming in, this is what we expect it to be, and hopefully there's not too much change unexpected. Where this is the most timely I've ever been, so we're at 1:30 exactly. So I'll end the webinar. Thanks everyone for coming on, and like I said, reach out if you have questions and I'll make sure the slides get around to you. All right. Bye.